Developed by Striking Distance Studios and published by Crofton for multiple consoles in 2022 was the Callisto protocol. In the year of 2320, Jacob and his partner Max are cargo transporters who work for the United Jupiter Company, who occasionally take illegal or illicit transport for extra credits. After working through legal and illegal means for a number of years, they decide to take one more job before the both of them have enough funds to retire. Through events, the pair head to the Black Iron prison upon Callisto, Jupiter's second largest moon. A terrorist-based group, the Outer Way, hijack the ship and it later crashes upon the moon's surface. Marx is killed in the shipwreck, and Jacob is taken into the prison and implanted with a biometric collar by the prison head doctor Caitlin Mahler. Jacob later learns that the Gaol is a hellish place under the control of Captain Leon Ferris and Warden Duncan Cole. Further events have a mysterious virus infect and systematically destroy the Gaol, and even Ferris is infected. As a result of the terrorists hijacking the ship, one of them encounters Jacob, being that of Dane Nakamura. The both of them are forced to work together against a partially infected Ferris, and Cole as the mastermind behind the whole situation on Callisto. Jacob and Danny learn from Mahler that Cole is affiliated with the secret organization Callisto, who ultimately wants to use the infection to force an evolution onto humanity to survive the harsh elements and environments of colonizing other planets. Cole later initiates a self-destruct failsafe for the Gaol and uses the infected Ferris as a weapon against Jacob to prove his argument about evolution. Jacob kills Ferris and helps Danny to obtain proof about the conspiracy and to escape Callisto, but Jacob later remains as Mahler mentions that there might be a way for him to escape as Ferris emerges once again to attack Jacob. Jacob later awakens back deep within Black Iron prison, with no real recollection of the final confrontation against Cole and the final fight against Ferris. Mahler then informs him that they both can't escape the Gaol before it explodes. Circumstances later have Jacob trying to escape Black Iron, but the entire layout of the prison is different from what he had experienced previously. On final events have Mahler killed and Jacob reaches ship which he can use to escape, but it's actually the rebuilt ship that he had first come to Callisto upon. Jacob later gets into the ship and pilots it off the moon, but in a final twist from the game's plot, the final transmission is nothing more than a massive hallucination by Jacob, as after the final encounter against Ferris and fighting off the infected so Danny could escape the moon, had him mortally wounded. Mahler is obtaining data from Jacob's biometric implant to salvage and transmit all of the data and memories of his elsewhere, as he then dies. And Mahler resigns herself to dying as the Black Iron prison is later destroyed. Development of the Callisto protocol originated with the formation of Striking Distance Studios, which had connections to PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. The game was supposed to be an expansion of the Battleground universe, but Glenn Schofield, who helped create the pivotal Dead Space series of games from the early 2000s, already had a concept for what would later be known as the Callisto protocol. Due to the impact that Dead Space had, Schofield desired to recreate the Dead Space feel of a game. Critics and analysts made comments about how the Callisto protocol was essentially that of a copy to a Dead Space video game concept, and that too much of an imitation to the Dead Space premise would negatively affect the final results of the game. Schofield made further comments that he had desired for the Callisto protocol to be an extremely frightening game for players, much like how Dead Space was interpreted when originally released. However, development of the game became more than what Striking Distance Studios had expected, and developers were later forced to work extra time to make up for the lack of progress with the game's development and ultimately its creation. Schofield even made a tweet glorifying the infamous crunch culture of modern video game development, which received much criticism. However, he was later forced to make an apology about what he had made through social media, but the skepticism of him as well as his comments to the Callisto protocol remained. From information now known, the video game was estimated to have cost roughly $162 million to create, and upon its release did not make back the initial budget. Investors originally expected roughly 5 million copies of the game to be sold soon after its release, but upon sales for the game, barely 2 million copies were made in the expected time. The situation relating to the game was so dire that stock for the game's publisher, Crofton, actually declined somewhat for a period of time due to the failure of the Callisto protocol. There were even claims that the final transmission wasn't originally supposed to be downloadable content, but in fact the original ending for the game. And the game was under such developmental problems that it had been put behind a paywall and remade as downloadable content. Criticisms of the game finally came from Jacob's lack of transparency or appeal as a main character. Due to the intentionally vague aspects of the game's story in terms of plot or in-depth lore, Jacob was depicted as a vague character who was purposefully moved by events depicted in the game, and as a result rarely questioned, refused, or even considered the circumstances that he was shown to be in. Jacob was often haunted by the death of Marks, and it wasn't only until the end of the game that players learned why. The hallucinations that Jacob saw were an aspect of guilt over his part in the outbreak on Europa. Players were often confused as to why Marks' dead visage would constantly be presented through the game, and even details about Jacob himself are nearly non-existent except for what was presented with importance to the game's story. Players never fully experience Jacob as a character, simply as a tool to arc through the game's progression and being a literal plot mechanism for the game itself. It was mentioned that the contagion was originally discovered from a gigantic alien creature at an abandoned colony, and genetic samples were obtained which later led to the pathogen that was synthesized and experimented on with prisoners at Black Iron. But Jacob was unable to learn any further details about it due to Ferris conveniently attacking him, and Jacob was later forced to leave the area and was never able to return there, and never questioned what had occurred. Mahler mentioned to Jacob and Danny that Cole was acting under orders from a mysterious group of individuals who had been influencing the progression of the human race for centuries, as that was the only time in the game, aside from circumstances at the game's conclusion, that such were mentioned according to dialogue. Jacob never questioned any of this, and players were left wondering why. Even with everything considered, Jacob felt too much under the control of events around him, or never anything unique that players could relate to or come to understand. A character can be overrated yet hated because they were intentionally based off another work of fiction, and rushed to completion before they had any individual aspect of being unique.